Hi, my name is Meredith. I'm a writer, and today I'm going to be putting my book through Shawn Coyne's story grid. Shawn Coyne's book, The Story Grid, is a method of editing your novel and specifically self editing. How do you dismantle your book and make it better by yourself without an editor's help? Of course, we all need editors who are specializing in developmental night edits and all those good things, but this is how to take your own book to the next level. I just finished reading this entire thing. It's essentially a textbook, like it is massive. But the reason why I read this book is because I could not find a resource on YouTube that would just take me through the actual story grid process. I wanted the grid, the method, the machine that you run your story through and you figure out how to make it better. I was like, give me the high points. I need those. I couldn't find anybody just doing that, the high points. And so that's what this video is for you. So essentially, I'm going to film this video in such a way that it's going to be step by step. It's going to be step by step for what I do, how I make sense of his method. It's going to be hopefully easy to follow along. So mainly this boils down into what I can see as two things. Number one is macro level storytelling, and number two is micro level storytelling, where we actually look at every single scene. It's like intense. And then there's a third step, basically making this grid with your story of internal and external plots and how they move up and down. I'm going to break it down into steps. We're going to start with macro, and then we're going to move to micro, and then we're going to go to combination. So step one is going to be creating what's called the foolscap, which is essentially named after a long piece of paper where you can fit all of the information about your global story in one place. So this is looking at the macro elements and analyzing them and making sure you have all of them. And if there's a major problem and you can't fill out one of these pieces of information, you know that you have something to work on, and you should go figure that out before you move on to the next part of the story grid, the micro information. So the foolscap method composes two parts. Number one, a chunk at the top that's going to be essential to all of your global story, and then you're going to go through by act and fill out some information for the 5 essential beats that are going to compose each of your 3 acts of your story. So let's get into talking about the first part, all of the global information that you need to fill out and know beforehand about your story. Let's start with external. So we've got external genre and external value at stake. Okay, so the idea of a genre is that your external plot, the conflict that's happening, the thing that's stopping them from getting their goal, that's going to have a specific shape. And there's lots of different external genres, maybe a love story, or there can be an action story, and there can be different subgenres of action or thriller or horror or western or war. And then Shawn Coyne argues that with every external genre, there is a value that's at stake. I've talked about this in a couple other videos. Maybe I will pop one up there. Basically, for the action genre, it's life versus death. And that's a really, really simple concept. And so for me, that's what I'm going to use. And also for a mystery plot, it's usually justice versus injustice. And that's really clear with like a legal system setup of, if there's a murder or if you're trying to solve something or bring something to justice or bring truth to light. So those are my external values, is life versus death and injustice versus justice. Those are our external values that we're playing with. And then we have internal. It's the internal journey the character is going on. And so it's not an external conflict. It's what is the character learning? What do they want internally, like in the big picture, and what is stopping them from getting that? There's lots of different plots here, but I'll just say for mine, it's disillusionment. And so it's this idea of you believe in something, and little by little, your worldview changes until you no longer believe in that thing. And you go from belief or blind faith to justified belief to confusion or doubt to disillusionment. And then there's another step further that's like depression or cynicism or nihilism. And that's kind of the progression of that internal character arc. And that happens to be his example in his story grid book. And that is also what my character does. The next thing he talks about is obligatory scenes and conventions, but he only lists the obligatory scenes and conventions of the thriller genre, and so that's not going to help me because I'm not writing a thriller. So basically, he says to figure out the obligatory scenes and conventions, you need to just read a lot in the genre. There might be online articles about this or extra resources. I'm just doing guesswork here. The next thing to know is point of view. This is not hard. I have 2 characters, and so point of view is going to be one or the other. Second to last thing is objects of desire. This is, I believe, both the tangible goal and also like the want, the emotional want. Whatever that object of desire is, you're going to write that out and keep that in the forefront of your mind because that's going to drive the story, is the protagonist's goal. And the last thing is the controlling theme or idea. This is really hard to pin down. He says basically just one sentence, and this is not generic. You have to really dive into what conflicts of themes and values are fighting here and what lesson you want the reader to walk away with. So for me, I have written all this stuff out, The next big thing to know, this is like a huge, huge, huge shocking point of his. There are 5 main components to a beat, which is the smallest component of a story. So we've got inciting incident, progressive complications, leading to a crisis, which is the decision point, and then a climax, which means that you take action, and then there's a resolution. Every scene should have these 5 elements, but then we can actually zoom out to say every act needs these 5 things. There's also those 5 elements baked into the whole global story. So how this works out with this foolscap method, where we're doing macro level storytelling, is you're going to write out these 5 elements for every act. Write down the scene that shows when each of these 5 elements is happening in Act 1, Act 2, and then Act 3. I'm gonna get to work and try to type this out and see what happens, and I will let you know what this looks like for me at the end of this. I feel like this is good because it just really helps you pin down the major, major, major beats. And you can really track this on to Save the Cat as well, but there's a lot lost in this simplification in the middle of the book. It doesn't leave room for a midpoint. There's no clear delineation between the fun and games and the bad guys close in. This is not as helpful as it could be, and I think maybe what would be more helpful is if you split it up into 4 sections and you did Act 1, and then you had all 5 of these elements for Act 2A, just the fun and games, and then the same set for Act 2B, the bad guys close in. So I think if you did 4 of these, this would probably work better. That is the major overview of the macro level stuff. So that's the foolscap. Hopefully that helped clarify the big, big bones of your story. And if you're having trouble there, that is a good look at what major bones need to be fixed before you move on. And now we move on to the next step. So now that we've finished the foolscap, the macro information, we have to go on to the story grid itself. And so this is going to be all of the information in each scene that we need to analyze to make sure our story is working. So in order to do this, there is a very essential first step, and it is to create a scene list. Just go ahead and just jot down the 1-sentence description of what is accomplished in your scene and write that out for every scene that you have. After you have your scene list, then you can move on to the next step. And this is going to be plugging your scenes into the story grid. You're going to list different aspects or attributes of the scene and analyze if they have them or if they need to be tweaked. And so how I started out my story grid is that I took the first 3 columns and I filled those out first because those aren't really using your brain. They're not analysis work. It's just setting the stage for doing the rest of the columns that are more of the analysis. And so first you want to list your scenes in a number from 1 to however many scenes you have, and then list the word count of that scene. So this is definitely helpful because then you can see if a scene is too long or too short, or if you're spending too much time on it, whatever. And then what I also did is, because I have a dual point of view, I put point of view, I dragged it from where it was kind of like way down the spreadsheet, and I put it right in the beginning so that I could always see what point of view my scene was in, because that's really essential for my book. So if point of view is, more than one or really essential for how you're organizing your book, I would put that in one of the beginning columns. Okay, so that's 3 columns. The first 3 are those things. And then in the 4th column, I have my actual sentences that describe my scenes. So that's how you set up the story grid. It took about 3 hours to fill out the first 4 columns of the story grid, and just those alone. I had to condense all my scenes down into just one phrase that basically describes what is accomplished in that scene, and so that took some brain work. And it turns out I don't have 170 scenes. When I actually look at the way the story grid describes a scene where it has those 5 elements, where it goes all the way up to, like a crisis, a climax, and a resolution, I actually have 112. And so some of my smaller scenes that I'd kind of partitioned so that I could keep them straight are actually involved in a bigger scene that happens at one location in time. And so I was able to condense it down to about 112 scenes and just do those first 4 columns, and that took about 3 hours between last night and this morning. So now I'm going to talk about all of the different columns that we're going to use to analyze the grid that you have now set up and all of your scenes. I'm going to take this kind of step by step and do them in pairs that make sense to me. So let's move on to that. So the next step is going to be filling out the value shift and polarity shift. I've already touched on this in a very, very broad sense, but there's more to it for these columns specifically. The value shift is not like the giant overall value shift of like life to death or blind belief to disillusionment. Like, that's not what we're talking about here. But what it actually looks like is an emotional shift. And some scenes are pivotal and actually change the value shift of the entire story, but most don't. Most go from some type of emotion to a different emotion. And so a lot of mine end up looking like hopeful to defeated or hopeful to successful. The point of this, I think, is to see if your scene shifts, if it develops, if it changes. And if it doesn't, there's nothing dynamic, there's nothing changing, there's nothing transformative going on in that scene. There's no forward movement. And so see if your scenes have shifts of values, of emotions. And how you track that shift is on the next column, which is going to be polarity shift on a scale from double positive to negative to double negative. What changed? So if something started out positive and then the emotional shift went to negative, then you're going to write positive to negative. Or if it went from positive to double positive, so it started out good, got better, the emotional shift in every scene can be encapsulated in one of those shifts. So pick one of those for every scene, and if a scene doesn't have that, think about changing that scene to make it more dynamic, or think about if it is attached to another scene and if it may be just the beginning part of another scene. And so maybe that's why things haven't changed. Filling out those 2 columns took about 2 hours, but that's mostly because I have so many scenes, and so there's just a lot to go through of figuring out the shift and the change, and also deciding what to do about a scene that doesn't have a shift or a change, and I did find a bunch of those. The other thing I noticed about this is that sometimes the shift, like the polarity shift, is different with external circumstances versus internal. You know, when something really good happens externally, and the character is maybe spiraling over something that happened earlier, and so internally they're on a negative downward arc, but their external circumstances are upward. Keep track of those things because the emotional shift may not be the same as the whole shift that's happening in the scene. Overall helpfulness of that step, I felt like it was helpful at least to go through all the scenes and like make sure there was shifting and dynamics. But I'm ready to see what else the story grid has in store for us. I'm really excited about this next part because the next 2 columns I think go together. So let's move on to the next step. So next will be decision and turning point. So I think I added the column decision. That might not be what he says to add in the actual grid, but here's why I think this is really, really essential is because throughout the entire book, and especially like while he's putting up this graph, he's like talking about how every single scene needs to have a character, the main character, whoever it's the point of view, making a decision. And that again helps with making the scene dynamic and changing and moving forward, and also just making sure your character has agency and has a stake in what's going on. And I thought that was so valuable that I wanted to make sure that every single scene in my book had a decision point. So I've added this decision column, and there's the turning point column. I think what this is a moment of surprise where the scene turns in some way and something unexpected happens. It can either be an information reveal or an action, either on the part of the character or on somebody else's part. You know, it could be an external event happening. Having this turning point is thinking about how can I surprise the reader with every single scene, and that's going to keep them reading. So tracking these 2 things helps give your characters agency, and it helps keep the book moving fast paced. So let's go through and for every scene add a decision and a turning point and see what happens. Okay, I'm 47 scenes in, so that's less than halfway. Yeah, we haven't quite made it to the midpoint yet. We're on our way there though. I've highlighted a bunch of decisions in red because of things like this, where it's one character's point of view, but a different character makes the pivotal decision in the scene. And it's so interesting because I was like, what is my point of view character deciding? They're not deciding anything. Like, where's their agency? They're just watching another character make a decision. Then why is it in their point of view? So I think that that is something to think about as we're going through this. I'm actually really surprised at how many of these naturally have decisions at the end and kind of follow the progression of a scene that Shawn Coyne has talked about. And so I'm kind of impressed with myself that I've actually been able to see what a good scene looks like in my own work and when a scene is sorely lacking one of those elements. And so I think this is a really good exercise. This one has seemed way more helpful so far than the previous one, but I think altogether this is going to give us a holistic picture of what needs to change and what needs to happen in this story to make it better. I'm going to keep going with this, and I will let you know my final thoughts on decisions and turning points, and then we will move on to the next step after that. Last night, I finished going through the 2 columns of decision making and turning point, and I feel really good about the stuff that I figured out because it's so clear when I put question marks in red where there's no decision made that there's something wrong with the scene. It's like very clear to me. And I'm like, oh yeah, there's no agency, or this is not a full scene in itself. And it's really a very helpful. This is what I have found to be the most helpful diagnostic tool is the decision making. Their turning point is interesting too, because I think the turning point levels the scene up like it creates interest, it creates suspense, and it keeps the reader reading. And so without this turning point, the scene lacks interest. It's not necessarily like make or break the scene, like the decision is, but it's also like if you don't have one, you should try to put one in. And so I've been thinking about that for mine. I'm like, why are they're just doing what they set out to do and nothing else happens? And if that's the case, like why not summarize it or something? The next part to do is going to be the location, duration, time or date, and the onstage characters and offstage characters. And this is more like detail oriented, not really big picture thinking, but it's keeping everything straight. It's a little bit like record keeping. I started doing a lot of this last night and this morning, and I don't think it's been again necessarily like this is going to create like developmental changes, but it was helpful to kind of see the progression, to make some choices about how long the story, covers over a span of time and what the dates are. And so that's the next step to do. So I'm actually going to do the third stage of the story grid in a different video because I think this one's getting very long. So I'm going to do the actual grid itself on paper in a different video and show you that whole process of basically taking everything we did here, the foolscap method, all of the stages of creating the grid itself, and we're going to turn that into the actual story grid that Shawn Coyne talks about. So that's not going to happen here. This is the prep work. This is the major brain work that's going to go into actually making the eventual product. Just a couple things to add on to the story grid. You can add columns for whatever you like, and I suggest doing this because I added a mystery plot column, and so in every scene that had like a mystery beat or a clue, I added that. And that was really clarifying to see actually where those mystery beats were landing in the story and where they're too concentrated. And then I also did a complications column where in every scene you're supposed to have some complications in order for them to get to their decision point. And in some scenes I was like, I don't have any complications. They just make decisions and do what they need to do. And so that means that I'm lacking conflict. So I found it helpful to add some extra columns just to make sure that this story is the best it could possibly be. From the day I started doing the foolscap method to now, my story looks very different. It is literally completely changed around. I found so many scenes I can cut and reduce, and I actually cut out a huge mystery beat in the fun and games. So I actually really enjoyed my time with this, and I think that I will definitely do this for my next book when I'm actually going in to do my revision plan for that, which will probably be in a couple months. So I'm glad I did it. I was like, I hope I'm not wasting my time, and I don't think I did at all. I will say that probably this method didn't do as much as I had hoped. Probably. Everybody in their writing craft books, they promise like a magic fix. Like, this is the last book on writing craft you'll ever need from Save the Cat. And you put your books through the story grid, you'll know what to do. And it's just like, that's just not always true. This isn't engineering. This isn't math. You can't just have an equation and get a good story out of it. Like, this just takes work and time. And I think that books like this tend to overpromise, and I got my hopes up a little bit. But that's not to say it wasn't super helpful and one of the most helpful writing tools that I have ever found. So you should totally pick up a copy, read it. Honestly, I hear that the blog articles are where the actual like really quality information is. And I would definitely recommend at least doing the scene by scene spreadsheet. I mean, it definitely took several hours to set up, but the analysis there I think was really helpful. That's all for this video. I will put up the next video of me actually doing the grid itself pretty soon. So stick around for that video if you want to see the conclusion of this little experiment. Subscribe for more videos like this and give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Thanks so much for watching. I will see you in the next video. Bye.